Me gustaría en este congreso que respetáramos bastante los tiempos, porque afortunadamente hemos recibido muchas propuestas, somos muchas y eso está muy bien. Y vamos a tener la oportunidad de intervenir muchas personas y entonces yo me gustaría ser un poco estricta con los tiempos. No lo vamos a lograr, pero lo vamos a intentar, ¿no? Entonces, vamos a empezar ahora con la mesa 1, entramos ya en materia, con las ponencias de la mesa 1, autopoiesis y ficciones de la identidad desde la perspectiva de género, que tendrá su sesión de comunicaciones esta tarde. Y tenemos y agradecemos enormemente a las ponentes KATY, DEEPWELL y MARGARITA DE AIZPURU, que están aquí conmigo, haber aceptado la invitación. Por cuestiones de organización, daríamos la palabra a KATY, luego a MARGARITA y luego abriríamos un debate, pero vamos a dar la palabra a KATY y cuando ella acabe vamos a hacer una pausa de 15 minutos para organizar las imágenes de la sesión de MARGARITA, y a partir de MARGARITA ya pasamos a la segunda parte. Y si vamos bien de tiempo, después de MARGARITA abrimos un pequeño debate, si no lo abrimos quizá al final de la mañana, ¿de acuerdo? Entonces yo voy a presentar ahora a KATY, que ya le he dicho que voy a presentar en español. Y bueno, KATY DEEPWELL, yo creo que la conocemos en España todas las interesadas en feminismo y arte contemporáneo, sobre todo gracias a este libro de cátedra y de la Universidad de Valencia en una colección de feminismo y cultura visual, titulado, del que ella es la editora, que es una antología de textos sobre arte y feminismo, titulado Nueva crítica feminista de arte, estrategias críticas, que de hecho yo creo que fue, cuando todo era un vacío bibliográfico, fue uno de los primeros libros de crítica feminista que pudimos leer o conocer en español. Aparte de eso, también yo creo es conocida en España sobre todo por ser la fundadora y la editora de una revista internacional de arte feminista, que ha tenido la amabilidad de traernos un número, que es este N Paradoxa, que además está también online, ¿no? Y que es uno de los órganos de la crítica de arte feminista. Además, KATY es profesora de arte contemporáneo, de arte y crítica, y especializada sobre todo en teoría y crítica del arte feminista. Aparte de y es profesora en la Universidad de Middlesex, y aparte de estos libros es autora y editora de muchos otros libros vinculados siempre a la crítica y la historia del arte contemporáneo feminista, entre los que puedo citar una antología de arte feminista y de arte y género. Es editora también de un libro titulado Women Artists and Modernism, y también una sobre crítica de arte y África, y además autora de cuantiosos libros sobre mujeres artistas. Entre sus títulos más recientes están Women Artists in Britain Between the Wars, y en 2018 recién publicado All Women Art Spaces in Europe in the Long 70s. Bien, we are so grateful to have you here, KATY. I'm going to introduce MARGARITA and then I will give you the... y a mi izquierda está MARGARITA DE AIZPURU, que también es bien conocida dentro de los estudios de arte feminista, porque lleva muchos años dedicándose, muy entregada, hemos coincidido alguna vez, muy entregada al arte feminista actual, contemporáneo, y sobre todo lo relativo a la performance. Es una auténtica especialista en performance, arte, activismo, feminismo, ¿no? MARGARITA es crítica de arte contemporáneo y además comisaria independiente de exposiciones, lo cual a mí me parece algo heroico en este país, y tiene un enorme mérito. Quizá en otros es más, las investigadoras independientes lo tienen más fácil. Aquí no hay mucho terreno abonado, a pesar de lo cual ella hace un trabajo verdaderamente espléndido. Aparte de eso, ha trabajado en el Departamento de Exposiciones Temporales del Pompidou, en la Fundación KATY de París, en el CAP de Burgos, en Zona Emergente del Centro Andaluz de Arte Contemporáneo y, como decía antes, ha sido comisaria de numerosísimas exposiciones de artes visuales contemporáneas, tanto en España como en Latinoamérica, Marruecos y Francia. También agradecemos enormemente a Margarita, que como crítica e investigadora independiente tiene además una agenda difícil y apretada, que haya aceptado nuestra invitación, ¿no? Bueno, pues empezamos entonces y empiezo dando la palabra a Katy. Thank you very much, Katy.
Okay, I have one.
Okay.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak. I came from the point of view of curiosity, because Spanish and English art historians don't often speak to each other. And it's not just a language problem, but I also came because I thought it would be interesting to hear what everyone else has to say at the conference. So thank you for inviting me to give the keynote. And I'm very pleased to be in another part of Europe today, exploring women artists and art history, while my country is deciding whether or not to be part of the EU or the EEA, or to go its own way at the margins of Europe. We're in a very island mentality. So, obviously what I have to say is very much conditioned by my own experience and by very much being in this English language bubble. So the references that I will give will probably seem very English and American to you. Okay, so I want to begin with these two quotes from Lisa Tickner and Griselda Pollock, because these suggest where the debate about art history and feminism is, and I'm trying to, in this speech, outline a series of propositions about where art history should go, where feminist art history should go. But I want to begin with this problem of definition, which Lisa Tickner's quote brings up very well, which is feminism is a politics, it's not a method. It's not a methodology. And she said this very clearly, and people in Britain have taken this on board. So we want to speak about a feminist problematic in art history and art criticism. So we have to define constantly where the problematic lies. And everything I'm going to say now is my attempt to explain this problematic at the moment. And the other thing is to point out that art history has many contests within it. Feminist art history, as a result, has multiple contests within it. There are multiple lines of thinking in feminist art history. It is not a singular entity. The other thing about Griselda Pollock's quote is the emphasis that she gives on social meaning and the symbolic operation of gender. So we are looking all the time at how ideas of masculinity and femininity are constructed by certain discourses. We do not say that these are natural. We do not say that these are fixed. We do not say that these are permanent. So we're looking at a situation which is constantly in flux, constantly changing. Over my lifetime, 20, 30 years, it has changed dramatically. So we have to map and understand these changes, and we have to think our way through them, and that's really at the heart of what I want to tell you this morning. So feminism has this quality now. It is complex, materialist, psychoanalytic, transnational, cosmopolitan, and historical in its dimensions. There is a very strong focus on sexual difference as the primary means to consider art and gender. However, we are still faced with a problem, and I've polarized the question of identity as sameness and difference as otherness. across these four concepts of thinking about exception, the term exception. And each variant in English presents us with a means to think differently about the constitution of readings and interpretations of the work of women artists. So in Euro-American culture, we continue to value all artists' contributions to contemporary art as examples of what is exceptional in our culture. Exceptional is a means of praise. And art history still aims to write the story of art by linking these exceptional case studies into many partial narratives about tendencies or trends. Art history tends to see its role as offering us more types of case studies, remarkable artworks, remarkable forms of practice, remarkable people as artists. And this is how art history continues to act as the handmaiden to the market or the museum. In art, to be recognized as unique and singular remains a key category of praise. It marks out what is the exception, as opposed to things that are registered and understood as exceptions to current rules. And the exceptions to current rules are often discarded or excluded. Exceptions are not valued in the same way as that which is exceptional. Exceptions in this sense have no transgressive value. They are left of field, odd or outside of the disciplinary boundaries of the field itself. The disciplinary field, art history, in which these disparate objects, artworks, are linked, is not neutral, but always aimed at someone, speaking to someone. The field itself is an ideological construct with a mode of address. This goes back to the social and symbolic dimension of gender. The field is not unitary or a monopoly determined by one or two authority figures who determine which objects are taken as canonical, even when, as all too frequently, Lisa Tickner notes in another essay, novelty, newness, is taken for rigor. And the focus is on a positivist view of art as a sequence of art objects, not on how the discipline objects to certain kinds of practice or sets limits on its own internal boundaries of investigation. These values in art around the exception and what is exceptional create enormous problems for speaking about women artists, because being a woman is not an exceptional state. Being a woman is 52% of the population. Being a woman is normal. There are always great exceptions among women. Think of all the prime ministers, the authors, the scientists. They have exceptional status, but they're only exceptional because they're often compared to the rest of us, all women, the normal. Exceptional in their achievements only because of this distinction. So the question is feminist arts history's job to be tracing only the exceptions, only the exceptional? In art, the feminine exception also has another meaning, which is captured by this quote by Lacan at the bottom of the slide. He suggests that the feminine exception is always, in its particularity, a contradiction to the masculine universal. And this is where we continue to play this game. We continue to repeat this mantra. The unusual woman artist, the exceptional woman artist, the great exception amongst artists who is a woman, contradicts an idea of the masculine universal. However, I think this is a trap. I think this is a problem. And I think we need to redraw the boundaries of this problem. And this is why. This vocabulary that we use all the time in art history And these are clusters of terms that we endlessly repeat in art history. We use these descriptions all the time. So on the right, your right, are the words of praise, and on the left are the words of indifference. And we use these descriptions all the time to tell people what are magnificent about artists and what is bad. And the thing is, women end up with the bad. Indifference, mediocre, weak, unsuccessful, failing. I do not think that this problem can be solved by reversing these terms. I do not think that we can solve this problem by turning the weak into the strong. But socially and symbolically, that's our job. We are given that problem, and we attempt to do it all the time. We get caught up in language. If we take seriously the problem, and I'll just illustrate this problem. How do we speak about women's success in the arts? Do we speak of it as a mountain that women have to climb, a mountain that they have to climb for objective achievement? Or do we speak about the mechanisms of art history and the museums as a filter, as a downward spiral to the few who will succeed? Okay? So this is the contradiction that we deal with in art history. The obstacle race or the selection process. And it's a stark choice in terms of vocabulary that we use. However, if we take seriously psychoanalysis and the claims to examine the unconscious of all human beings, this, as Jacqueline Rose points out, there is a failure of identity in all subjectivities. Identity doesn't have this completeness that we seem to strive, against which the other is constructed. Identity itself is full of fractures. There is, and this is what she says, because there is no continuity of psychic life, so there is no stability of sexual identity, no position for women or men which is ever simply achieved. Nor does psychoanalysis see such failure as a special case, inability, or individual deviancy from the norm. Failure is not a moment to be regretted in the process of adaptation or development into normality. Instead, failure is something endlessly repeated and relived, moment by moment, through individual histories. So the question is now, if the problematic of feminism is to look for flawed subjectivity in women, we're going to end up with a very strange art history. Okay? So I want to give this as a problem. This is a sociological example of feminist research on art and gender from the Netherlands by Titje Top. And what she has done here in this sociological analysis is attempt to map how sociology discusses women artists. So it's always the artist that is discussed. It's always the person that is discussed, not the artwork. So this is the problem that I want to draw attention to, because at its worst forms, if we focus only on the woman artist and think about her personality, we will constantly miss many of the things that we need to speak about. So this kind of focus on the person has produced a whole series of myths that I want to draw attention to. And these myths tie into this bad vocabulary about artists. So women are always seen as dependent on their teachers. This influence continues beyond their time as a student. This is what dependency makes their work derivative and unoriginal. Women's autonomy is constrained because they're economically dependent on their father, their family, their partner. So their work is small in size and never reaches huge ambition. Their partner changed their life. So we always talk about their sexual relationships. Why are we so focused on their sexual relationships? It's not them, it's not their desire, it's not their ambition, it's not what they produce, just who they had sex with and who they live with. Even where women are well-educated, well-travelled, economically independent, they can never achieve their potential. This is another myth that we keep saying. Because of their bourgeois expectations of them as wives and mothers. And this affected them even when they didn't have children or have many children. They were stopped from being an artist. This is all the obstacles. I'm going to rehearsing the obstacle argument. They were stopped from being an artist by this, even when they were privileged, educated, and mobile. So we must now consider negatives: alcoholism, mental depression, lack of money, lack of opportunity, abusive relationships. All reasons why, in setting the scale of what they did or didn't do. So I give this as an example because I went to see this show and I was very impressed by the artist, but I couldn't find any of the traits of what I was impressed by in the descriptions of how she was presented. This woman artist from Denmark moved to Paris. She took the studio next to Giacometti in the 1930s. She set herself up as an independent artist in Paris, way after her education. She wanted to be a leading member of the avant-garde. So now she is credited as being a leading member of the Danish modernism, a key figure, a part of the Cobra movement. However, there are many things that are presented in the work that she did, which again fall back into this narrative. Her uncompromising, stubborn self-criticality. So she didn't produce as much work as she should have. By whose standards? Right? The rare pieces that she produced are contained in one room. So you see immediately a limit to what she actually achieved. They found it very difficult to handle how to present her marriage. She did the most remarkable thing in 1942. She married a South African, and he was interned in an internment camp in Paris, and they still got married. They lived together for 50 years. They had a very, very happy marriage. There's a very beautiful letter in the exhibition, which obviously doesn't appear on the thing, where she writes, "You complete me." It's a very lovely letter. The very significant, very important relationship in her life. Together, they explored, as an art historian points out, this is why I've included this slide, this image. This is an art historical analysis of the achievement of her work in the Cobra group, because she was one of the few people who did not take a patronizing view of African art, but regarded it as an inspiration for her work, a new form of looking at the world, and a new form of images. And most of her work, very interestingly, is a deconstruction of masculinity and power. So she deconstructs world relations in the image of 4 continents and people from 4 continents working together. She's very focused on the image of the warrior, African warrior, but also the aggressive masculinity in the African warrior. Now, what's interesting for me is there is no feminist analysis. Feminist art history doesn't seem to be interested in this kind of modernism. So why, if we are really reclaiming all women artists, why are there only certain women artists who we are interested in foregrounding and not others? And this is a question for feminist art history. This is more typical, and this exhibition, which was on a year ago in London, is a very close visualization of significant others, which is a very important book in feminist art history. Even so, to copy on the publicity the relationship between Leonora Carrington and Max Ernst, which was on the front cover. This is how close a copy it is to the actual book. But again, in attempting to diversify the significant couples into queer theory and queer relationships and often threesomes, not just twosomes, it doesn't succeed in presenting a feminist view. In fact, the feminism has been evacuated from this argument. It's been removed. So this quote here, which I don't think you can read very well because it's a very poor slide, but this quote says that we will be the brother of the man. That's the feminism. So women here, symbolically, are just occupying the male position. This is not feminism, to me. We have had huge mapping exercises, you know, of feminist artists, huge mapping exercises. These are just some of the largest that there have been. Delia Gaze's dictionary, this is started by Anne Sutherland Harris and Linda Nochlin in their famous show Women Artists 1550 to 1850. Now online there are several huge indexes of women artists. Aware is just one of them, you know, but there's the Elizabeth Sackler Center for Feminist Art. They have a huge database of women artists. So we have endless amounts of information. We have hundreds of pieces of information about the biographies of women artists. What are we doing with them? Are we expanding the terms of art history? How will we get to the point that we don't just look at one woman artist, but we can see patterns amongst women artists? We can see a sociological understanding of the fact that women artists are not handicapped by not going to education. Women artists in Europe particularly have had education for 150 years, and they have emerged as 1/3 of the profession, even in the 1910s. They were 1/3 of the profession, and now today they're 50% of the profession. So this myth that women are rare and special is not true. And we have to change the whole vocabulary to account for this. Okay. I do not think that we can solve this problem by reversing men for women. And this piece, which was the opening piece of Elle at Centre Pompidou, which is nice as a little joke about the ways in which we must deflate masculinity in order to praise femininity, I don't believe it. It won't work. But equally, the question of identity and alterity that you want to explore has been sidetracked into a little box, and this slide from MoMA Learning suggests that, because they have their set artists, they have a way of privileging these questions of identity and alterity, again without feminist politics. Feminist politics has disappeared from the picture. So if you think that by pursuing identity and alterity you're pursuing feminism, you must be very clear about the politics in which you want to foreground. So now I'm going to give you a more complicated idea, which came from a paper that I wrote before in a couple of years ago in 2011, which was published on a Spanish website in English. And there I tried to use Lacan as a kind of metaphor for a static relationship, because I was trying to find a way to explain the hypervisibility of a few women artists in contemporary art in contrast to the disappearance of the majority and the silence on the majority. So I was trying to find a metaphor to explain this, and this is where I came up with, I got rather curious about what Slavoj Žižek said about symptoms and the exception, the exception that kind of, again, proves the rule, this Lacanian point, the exception proves the contradiction to the rule, the otherness to the rule. And I felt that this didn't really work, but it did work to explain why women were constantly positioned as others, as the couple, in the couple kind of psychology of art history, always as the lesser, the mediocre, you know, the muse, the wife, partner, lover. etc., and never explained in terms of the content of what they were producing. So I came up with this idea of this what is the other of the other? Well, Lacan says there is no other of the other. So then what you have is you have the figure of otherness as a kind of like a big other, a kind of mentality of the big other, which frames the discourse but actually has no reality, has no existence. You have a big other with no existence, but then you also have a not all, things that are outside symbolization completely. And the not all is where the majority of women artists are. They are outside symbolization. They're not talked about. They're not discussed. So you have those that are discussed presented as identity and otherness, always on the side of otherness against the male artist as the sole owner of identity. But then you have this fantasy of the big other, this fantasy which everybody orientates themselves around, and yet there's a not all. So this is why I use this metaphor. But then I started to look a bit closer. Lacan's theory is very complex, multi-layered. So then I started to think about particularly his four alternative discourses. And I think that there's probably some mileage here to think about the four alternative discourses. So he says here the university. The university is focused on the master discourse in relationship to systems of objects, systems of desire. The master's discourse is focused on making statements. You make statements to contribute to the major discourse. The hysteric, we are hysterical. I am hysterical, mad, bad, hysterical woman, right? I am the split subjectivity who's trying to make a statement in a culture which will not recognize my statement. It is incoherent. It makes no sense. And the privileged position of the analysand, Mr. Lacan, who regards his tracing of objects as producing discourse. You see, so I think it's quite interesting that this complex diagram might enable us to speak differently about what we're trying to do. And that was my suggestion by this deviation into Lacan. But Lacan himself, very tricky guy, he says many things. He says that actually, useful as this framework is, it does not explain everything. We all want an explanation, a totalizing explanation, but there is no totalizing explanation. So even though by way of these figures, by his mathematical equations, we might be able to specify certain things about how discourse functions, it will fail. It will not be complete. So we have to remember the incompleteness of the statement. Okay, so here are the big discourses that we use in art history. And I use this map when I'm teaching. It's a map of keywords and terms that we use to orientate ourselves. So we contrast the modern with the postmodern and the contemporary. We speak about their relationships to modernity, postmodernity, and contemporaneity, which is an invention of Terry Smith's. We try and explain the avant-garde in its multi-dimensional facets. We talk about the difference from academic art and the anti-aesthetic as an alternative avant-garde. And we also introduce post-colonialism. Now, we use these terms all the time, but in art history we are fighting a plan all the time about when any of these terms existed, continued to function, or died. People don't talk about postmodernism so much. It used to be at the center of debate. Postmodernism was seen to be a break from modernism when? 1950s, according to Ihab Hassan in literature. 1980s, according to painting and sculpture, the return to painting and sculpture. When did the contemporary start? 1989? This is 1989 is considered the break year, the moment of Magicien de la Terre? Or is it contemporary starts in the 1960s, late 1960s? Is it post-1968 that we mark the contemporary moment and we start talking about the 70s? If we use these classifications, this is the master discourse. Will the master discourse work to explain what feminism is? And this is the question that I'm also raising today. So will this master discourse enable us to think about feminist pioneers, feminist avant-gardes, feminist leaders, or will we have to substitute and change the terms of this discourse in order that the hysterical voice of feminism speaks? Okay? So this is another diagram that I try and use to show how feminist art has multiple definitions of what is happening to feminist art in the contemporary moment. There are attempts to describe feminist art as a movement and to describe it in modernist terms as an avant-garde. This works in some respects if you're the collector of the Sammlung Verbund, a collection where you've deliberately chosen, I hope you know the show Feminist Avant-Garde, which has been touring around Europe and has a huge telephone directory of a book mapping the collection, which is based on photography, video, performance. This works if you want to describe it as an avant-garde, and it works for that one small moment at the beginning of the 70s. However, there are other trends and tendencies in feminism which it doesn't capture. And here, my attempt is to look at art informed by feminism, which is Mary Kelly's definition, and to think about feminism differently from the traditional art historical vocabulary. And if you start to think about feminism differently, you will be led down a completely different path, which will also cause you to reject many of the classifications that the modern, postmodern contemporary has set up for you. This is just to show you the Feminist Avant-Garde show, which has been touring Europe. And this would be part of the alternative, perhaps, which is considering the collective practices of women artists. So these are two exhibitions where feminists today have got together to consider a feminist exhibition in the past and reformulate its propositions for the present. So this is Magma, which was a show that was organized in Italy in the 1970s and was reformulated today by the work of a collaboration between Italy and Lithuania. Lithuanians weren't in the first show. And this is in Australia, an attempt by a group of women to look again at the women's exhibition, the women's show from '77, and to again formulate ideas about contemporary feminism in Australia with thinking about the past. Now, I jokingly said to someone, and this is my attempt to illustrate it, if the global is an economic formation, two of the kind of leading tendencies in global thinking have been to think in terms of BRIC, British, Russia, India, China. So we can have a BRIC formation of feminism quite quickly. We can look at leading women artists in Britain, in Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Or we can have a MINT. This is another economic formation about developing countries in the world. So that's Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Thailand. So we have a MINT version of feminism. So what I'm really trying to suggest by this is that the global dimension of feminism and women artists in a global dimension has expanded beyond the individual women artists, beyond the national history, and now we have to start thinking transnationally and globally about this problem. This is what a global exhibition of women artists or with women artists looks like today. And this was one of the examples that I had about the not all. So it was reviewed by a British colleague who ignored all the women artists in the show, even though 50% of the show were women. this was a not remark. This was something unexceptional, but the work itself was irrelevant to the review, was not mentioned. So this is, even though Phila de Barlow, who's from Britain, was not mentioned in the review, but won the prize in the show. So there's a big contradiction here about the failure of art criticism to deal with the reality of exhibition. However, this is a counterexample, which is, why is it that the art world in general, the art market, particularly feminist research, has been obsessed with two figures, Louise Bourgeois and Pippi Lotti-Rist. There's probably about 10 books on each of them which are inspired by feminist scholarship. It's because it so neatly fits this transition of contemporary art, new explorations of new media, installation, video, and images of the body and representation, women's bodies and subjectivity in representation. I admire these artists enormously. I've written on them myself, but at the same time, I wonder why we're so obsessed with certain examples and not others. And that's the problem I want to draw your attention to. This is the reality of women today. So this is just a slide to remind you of the volume of women artists who could be gathered in one place around one exhibition. This is around an exhibition of abstract art. And these are women artists also involved in the production of abstract work in the States who came together on one day to take this photograph. So we're dealing with a question of volume, not rarity. This is an example of a kind of contrast that I wanted to describe between an idea of progress and an idea of disappearance, visibility and progress. So Paulina Olszewska from Poland is revered because she deals with images from the Soviet past. There's a kind of nostalgia in the work, a deconstructive nostalgia, but it's in the work. But then it would take a Croatian artist, conceptual artist, to actually consider the position of women artists in solidarity and their disappearance from history. So we have this very interesting tension between these two examples of what is revered in New York, which is Paulina Olszewska, and what might be revered in Poland as a capturing of a socialist history. I saw this exhibition in Japan. It was very funny. And this is also, the world is changing because museums are now competing with each other to present women artists on a grand scale. So when I went to the National Museum of Modern Art, they had a room reserved for women artists of the 1970s because, as they admit on the label, almost like an obscene warning, there are no women artists before this room in our collection. So again, suddenly they've assembled a room of women from the 70s only, and only working in abstraction. The rest of the collection has one or two pieces by Kosama, Atsuko Tanaka from Gutai, but nothing else. So we again have women as exceptional, separate, locked in a little box, and not part of the general story. At the Tate has been rehung, so 1/3 of the exhibition is now women artists suddenly in the contemporary moment. This is the highest proportion it has ever been in the history of the Tate. And 50% of the solo exhibitions are now women. So there is a magnificent moment going on where we're exploring women in the alternative avant-garde, Irina Nakova or Zhao Lu. Again, we're still in the brick moment, but nevertheless, these are two women artists who've been brought to the fore. And just to say, I hope they've been reading M. Paradoxa, because I published 2 major articles 10 years before on these 2 women to try and draw them to public attention. I think we need a new conception, but this new conception of the local and the global has been in feminism for a long time. But what we don't seem to have is we have a retreat to a very white, liberal, feminist history, which is centered on the body. And even though people are looking for examples of other bodies in other cultures to reify their work, we need a more wholesale renegotiation of these categories that we use. And these are just two examples of how we might start to think about the local, the locale, the location in which people's work, but also the intense exploration of post-colonial multicultural languages, which are not of one order, not an otherness. This is just to demonstrate some of the work that I've been doing with Paradoxa. We did a survey of 37 countries, of PhD research in 37 countries. We came up with 1,000 PhDs. Because university repositories are linked together, you can now access these within a few clicks of the mouse. But we just wanted to show where the research was visible. There are these are taken from my website. You can go there, WWKT Press, and just find this material. But I wanted to show how much I have published transnationally, internationally, globally, against the volume of literature which I have been slowly collecting and documenting on the site, and to show you that there is a relationship between kind of volume of research that is actually published and certain hotspots in the world. This is not a global view. Contemporary art doesn't have a global view. On average, about 70 or 80 countries are really in the contemporary art market. And I always say that it's nice to compare it to football, because football is a global phenomenon, and 200 countries do play football, but actually only about 70, 80 countries are really engaged in the field of contemporary art, as in going to international biennales, holding international art fairs, participating, having gallery infrastructure, having museum infrastructure, having art critical infrastructure. So this is near the end, and this is just to show you that I've been trying to analyze the work that I did in Paradoxa over the last 20 years, and I've been trying to come up with a map of the types and tendencies in art criticism about women artists. So this is the best map that I've got at the moment to try and explain to you what I see as the directions in feminist writing at the moment. There is still a very strong liberal feminist tradition, and I don't want to underestimate this, where a woman artist is endlessly reconstructed as the marginal figure, the other figure. But I feel that this story has got to change. We cannot continue with that story anymore. We've got to change the narrative. There are too many lost, recovered women artists. It doesn't make sense anymore to talk in that way. We need a much broader sweep, a much broader characterization of the work that they are doing. So these are some of the alternatives. The material feminists tend to stress women artists' multiplicity, women's artists' labor, women's artists' work, and they also tend to focus on analysis of sex, race, and class. However, women's work is always presented as precarious. Never an achievement, it's always precarious. Then we have writers who are projecting a kind of feminist cosmopolitan multiculturalism, which is based on an analysis of cities, an analysis of people working in cities, and an analysis based on the major international shows, which are largely based in cities. And then we also have a queer post-colonial feminism, which is attempting to fuse together in quite imaginative ways all kinds of different art practices. However, there's a kind of reification, a kind of praising of certain types of artists. You know, like we will only go for artists who we can identify as lesbian, black, blah, 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 like all put together, and those will only be the ones that we study, and anyone who is white and of one nation is never subjected to the same form of analysis. So I really, in thinking about object A, in thinking about who are the objects of desire for feminist art history, who do we constantly focus on and study, and why, right? This is really what I want to get across, because we really risk missing changing the discourse, which I felt always was the purpose and meaning of feminist art history. We won't change the discourse if we just continually come back to these objects of desire. That's my theory. And the last quote, which is Jacques Lacan, and this has been much used, that feminism has to think about its past, it has to reconstruct and work on feminist discourses, but it does so in a way in which it's both projecting a future and looking at the past. And this future anterior notion of how discourse itself works is very central to the project that feminist art histories must now set themselves.
Thank you. So we are going to make the break and we will discuss later. Okay?
Are we going to have questions now? Oh, you want a break now?
Okay. We'll do the questions and answers after Margarita, okay? Bueno, muchísimas gracias a Katy. Ha sido increíblemente sugerente este inicio. No, hemos pensado, como va en la misma mesa que Margarita, juntamos las preguntas con... Vale, o sea, vamos a... Thank you very much, Katy. Realmente nos ha dado... Solo la diapositiva del mapa de los feminismos daría no para una conferencia, sino para un grado, vamos. Ahora les explico lo que he dicho. Bueno, vamos a descansar 10 minutos, 15, porque necesitamos montar las imágenes de la conferencia de Margarita. Entonces hacemos ahora el break, ¿vale? A la vuelta. Por favor, en 10 minutos, 15, de vuelta de verdad para... Ah, y se puede tomar café. Se puede tomar café. Estáis todos invitados estos. No, I have said that only this scheme will be a talk or will be, I mean, a big course, you know. It is so suggesting, so interesting that, I mean, only with that you have to talk, because so everything is really great. I mean, it has